Hey everyone, welcome back to another deep dive into history's most uncomfortable truths. Tonight we're sailing into the frozen hell that was Viking life, where the smell of unwashed bodies mixed with sea spray was considered luxury cologne, and your life expectancy was roughly the same as a mayfly with commitment issues. Before we set sail on this journey through Norse nightmares, take a moment to like the video if you enjoy falling asleep to tales of historical suffering, and subscribe only if you genuinely want more content about why the past was absolutely terrible. Let me know in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is. I always love seeing who's joining me for these midnight historical therapy sessions. Now, grab a warm blanket, maybe turn on some white noise, and settle in as we explore why being a Viking wasn't the Hollywood adventure you've been sold, but rather a one-way ticket to frostbite, starvation, and death by dysentery. Let's begin with the harsh reality that most Vikings weren't actually Vikings at all. Chapter 1. The Myth versus the Misery. When most people think of Vikings, they picture Chris Hemsworth with perfect teeth and suspiciously clean hair, sailing around in pristine longships while delivering witty one-liners. The reality was more like unwashed men with rotting teeth, sailing around in boats that leaked like sieves while delivering nothing but disease and despair to everyone they encountered, including themselves. First, let's clear something up. Viking wasn't actually an ethnicity or even a full-time job. It was more like a summer internship from hell. The word Viking meant to go raiding, which was seasonal work that Scandinavian farmers did when their crops were growing and they had nothing better to do than sail across freezing seas to steal other people's stuff. Most of these so-called Vikings were just regular Norse farmers who spent most of their year knee-deep in mud, fighting off starvation and wondering why they hadn't been born somewhere warmer. The typical Norse farmer lived in what can only be described as a wooden refrigerator with a leaky roof. These longhouses were shared with entire extended families, plus their animals, because apparently privacy was a luxury they couldn't afford. Picture trying to sleep while your cousin's cow is having digestive issues 3 feet from your head, and you're starting to understand why raiding looked attractive. Winter in Scandinavia lasted roughly 9 months, during which the sun became a distant memory and everyone's primary hobby was not dying of hypothermia. Food stores dwindled, people got cabin fever, and by spring, the idea of sailing across dangerous seas to steal from strangers seemed like a perfectly reasonable career move. It was basically seasonal affective disorder with weapons. The longships that have become so iconic weren't actually designed for comfort. They were basically oversized canoes with delusions of grandeur. No covered areas, no sleeping quarters, no bathroom facilities. Just an open boat where 30 to 60 men would spend weeks cramped together, sharing body heat, seasickness, and increasingly creative curse words in Old Norse. Every man on that ship knew there was a decent chance he'd never see home again. Storms could sink them, enemy forces could slaughter them, disease could kill them, or they might simply get lost and starve to death somewhere in the North Sea. But the alternative, another winter of near starvation in a frozen longhouse, made the risk seem worthwhile. The transformation from farmer to raider wasn't just about putting on armor and picking up an axe. It was about accepting that your life had become so desperate that sailing into the unknown to commit acts of violence against strangers was your best option for survival. That's not heroic adventure. That's what happens when civilization barely exists and winter lasts most of the year. Chapter 2. The Longship from Hell. Let's talk about the famous Viking longships, those sleek vessels that have captured imaginations for centuries. In reality, they were floating torture devices designed by people who apparently thought comfort was for the weak and seasickness-built character. A typical longship was about 70 feet long and maybe 16 feet wide, which means you had roughly the same personal space as a sardine in a particularly crowded can. Between 30 and 60 warriors would be crammed into this wooden nightmare for voyages that could last weeks. There were no beds, no privacy screens, no bathroom facilities, and certainly no room service. Just hard wooden planks, your fellow raiders' increasingly pungent body odor, and the constant possibility of drowning. The ships were built for speed and shallow draft, which meant they could navigate rivers and be pulled up onto beaches. But this design came at a cost. They rode low in the water, meaning every wave brought spray washing over the sides. In the North Atlantic, that spray was approximately the temperature of liquid nitrogen, and it never stopped coming. Imagine being constantly splashed with ice water while trying to row for 12 hours straight, and you're beginning to understand why most Vikings had the life expectancy of a medieval goldfish. Storage space was minimal, so everything had to serve multiple purposes. Your shield wasn't just for protection. It was also your dinner plate, your pillow, and sometimes your toilet paper if things got really desperate. Personal belongings were limited to what you could carry, which usually meant one change of clothes, your weapons, and maybe a small pouch of silver if you were lucky enough to own any. Food on these voyages was a symphony of preserved misery. Dried fish that had the texture of leather and roughly the same flavor. Hardtack biscuits that could break teeth and often contained more weevils than wheat. Sour milk that had curdled into something resembling cottage cheese, if cottage cheese could achieve sentience and plot revenge. Water, stored in wooden barrels, would go stagnant within days, developing a green film that the Vikings learned to strain through their teeth. Sleep was a luxury that had to be carefully rationed. With limited space and the need to maintain watches, men would curl up wherever they could find room, often spooning with their fellow warriors for warmth. This wasn't bonding, this was survival. Body heat was the difference between waking up and becoming a Norse popsicle. The ships had no protection from the elements. Rain soaked everyone to the bone. Sun burned exposed skin to blisters, and wind cut through their woolen clothing like it was gossamer. Storms were particularly hellish experiences. The longship would be tossed around like a toy, water would pour over the sides, and men would have to bail furiously while trying not to get thrown overboard. More than one raider met his end not in glorious battle, but by slipping on a wet deck and disappearing into the dark water. Navigation was a combination of educated guesswork, following migrating birds, and praying to whatever gods might be listening. GPS was about 1,000 years in the future, so getting lost was a constant possibility. Ships would sometimes sail for days in the wrong direction, burning through precious food supplies while morale plummeted faster than their chances of survival. The psychological toll was immense. Imagine being trapped in a cramped, wet, cold space with 60 increasingly desperate men, not knowing if you're sailing toward treasure or death, while your food supplies dwindle and the horizon remains stubbornly empty. Fights would break out over the smallest things: who got the driest spot to sleep, who ate more than their share of the rancid fish, who wasn't rowing hard enough. These weren't noble warriors. They were hungry, scared, cold men taking out their frustrations on each other because they had no other outlet. Chapter 3: Preparing for the Raid, the Logistics of Misery. Before any Viking could sail off to terrorize foreign shores, he had to survive the preparation phase, which was often more dangerous than the actual raiding. Getting ready for a Viking expedition was like planning a camping trip, if camping involved potential death by violence and the camping supplies were limited to whatever you could steal or make with your own hands. First came the recruitment phase. The raid leader, usually a jarl or wealthy farmer with delusions of grandeur, would travel around the local area trying to convince men to join his venture. This wasn't a difficult sell during the harsh Scandinavian winters, when the alternative was sitting in a frozen longhouse, slowly starving while listening to your relatives argue about whose turn it was to feed the pig. The recruitment pitch was basically, "Hey, want to sail across dangerous seas in an overcrowded boat, fight people who don't want to be robbed, and probably die horribly? But if we succeed, you might get enough silver to not starve next winter." Surprisingly, this was considered an attractive offer. Weapons had to be gathered, and here's where things got complicated. A proper Viking sword was expensive, worth about the same as a small farm. Most raiders couldn't afford one, so they made do with axes, spears, and whatever sharp objects they could cobble together. Some Vikings went into battle with farming tools, because apparently a good scythe was better than no weapon at all, even if it made you look like the world's most violent agricultural worker. Armor was similarly improvised. The mail shirts you see in movies were luxury items owned by the wealthy few. Most Vikings wore leather jerkins if they were lucky, or just their regular clothes with maybe an extra layer for protection. Some raiders fashioned armor from whatever materials they could find: hardened leather, metal strips, even thick cloth layered multiple times. The result was often protection that was only slightly more effective than wishful thinking. Food preparation was an exercise in preserving things that were already barely edible. Fish would be dried until it achieved the consistency of shoe leather, then stored in barrels where it would slowly decay. Meat was salted with precious salt that had to be traded for, creating a preservation method that made the food technically edible but guaranteed that every meal would taste like the ocean's revenge. The Vikings also had to prepare for the psychological warfare aspect of raiding. They cultivated reputations for savagery partly as a tactical advantage. If people were terrified of you, they might surrender without a fight, saving everyone the trouble of actual combat. This meant practicing intimidating war cries, perfecting menacing expressions, and generally learning to look like the kind of person who would burn down a monastery just for fun. Ship preparation was its own nightmare. The longships needed to be checked for leaks, which there always were, and the gaps between planks had to be sealed with whatever waterproofing materials they could find. This usually meant a mixture of tar, animal fat, and hope. Oars had to be carved and replaced, sails had to be mended, and the entire vessel had to be loaded with supplies that would somehow sustain 30 to 60 men for weeks at sea. The psychological preparation was perhaps the most important and the most overlooked. These men were about to sail into the unknown, knowing that many of them wouldn't return. They said goodbye to families they might never see again, made peace with enemies, and tried to settle their affairs as if writing a will, except their will consisted of, "Please don't let the pigs eat everything while I'm gone." Religious preparation involved sacrificing animals to various Norse gods, asking for favorable winds, successful raids, and the kind of divine protection that might prevent them from dying horribly in a foreign land. These sacrifices were expensive. A farmer sacrificing a cow for divine favor was gambling his family's survival on the hope that the gods would pay attention and care about his particular maritime venture. Chapter 4. Setting Sail, the Voyage to Hell. The actual departure was often delayed multiple times by weather, supply problems, or the simple fact that convincing 30 terrified farmers to climb into a leaky boat and sail toward probable death took more effort than expected. When the longship finally pushed off from the shore, it marked the beginning of what could charitably be described as a floating nightmare. The first challenge was getting out of the fjords and into open water without sinking, running aground, or having half the crew jump overboard and swim back to shore. The ships were heavily loaded and rode low in the water, making them sluggish and prone to taking on water in even moderate seas. Every wave that broke over the bow sent gallons of freezing seawater sloshing around the bottom of the boat, soaking everyone's belongings and requiring constant bailing. Rowing was the primary means of propulsion, and it was backbreaking work. Each oar was roughly 12 feet long and required significant strength to pull through the water effectively. The oars had to be synchronized or the ship would veer off course or, worse, the oars would clash together, potentially injuring the rowers. This coordination had to be maintained for hours at a time, with men's hands bleeding from gripping the rough wood, their backs screaming in protest. The sailing conditions in the North Atlantic were uniformly terrible. The water was cold enough to kill a man in minutes if he fell overboard, and the weather was unpredictable and violent. Storms could appear with little warning, transforming a difficult voyage into a fight for survival. The longships would be tossed around like toys, water pouring over the sides faster than it could be bailed out, while the crew tried to keep the ship pointed into the waves to avoid being swamped. Navigation was an art form practiced by people who had no business being artists. The Vikings used a combination of coastal landmarks, the position of the sun when it was visible, the behavior of seabirds, and educated guesswork. When fog rolled in, which it frequently did, navigation became pure luck. Ships would sail in circles, waste precious food and water, and sometimes end up further from their destination than when they started. The psychological toll of the voyage was enormous. Men who had never been more than a day's walk from their homes were suddenly surrounded by endless water, with no guarantee they would ever see land again. Seasickness was universal and prolonged, turning strong warriors into miserable, vomiting wrecks who could barely hold their oars. The constant dampness led to skin problems. The poor diet caused scurvy and other nutritional diseases, and the close quarters bred conflicts that could turn violent. Privacy was non-existent. Every bodily function had to be performed in front of 30 to 60 other men, leading to a breakdown of dignity that was both necessary for survival and psychologically devastating. The smell became indescribable, a combination of unwashed bodies, vomit, human waste, rotting food, and bilge water that had been sloshing around the bottom of the boat for weeks. Food ran low quickly, and water even faster. The Vikings had to carefully ration their supplies, knowing that running out of food meant slow starvation, while running out of water meant a faster but equally unpleasant death. Men would eye each other's portions, suspecting others of taking more than their share, leading to fights that could result in someone going overboard in the middle of the ocean. Sleep was fitful and uncomfortable. Men would curl up on the hard wooden deck, using their shields as pillows and their cloaks as inadequate blankets. The motion of the ship made rest difficult, and the need to maintain watches meant that everyone was perpetually exhausted. Dreams, when they came, were usually of dry land, warm beds, and food that didn't taste like salted despair. The constant threat of death hung over everything. A broken mast could leave them stranded. A serious leak could sink the ship. Bad weather could drive them into rocks. An injury or illness could kill without any possibility of medical help. Every man on the ship knew that his life depended on the boat holding together, the weather staying manageable, and their meager supplies lasting until they reached land. Chapter 5: The Art of Viking Intimidation. Before we get to the actual rating, let's talk about the psychological warfare that was as much a part of Viking strategy as axes and shields. The Vikings understood that reputation was a weapon, and they cultivated an image of savagery that often did half their work for them. But maintaining this reputation required actually being savage, which meant doing things that would haunt your dreams long after the silver was spent. The Berserkers were the Vikings' special forces, warriors who worked themselves into a battle frenzy that made them fearless, unpredictable, and absolutely terrifying to face. But becoming a Berserker wasn't just about being tough. It required a kind of deliberate psychological damage that turned men into living weapons at the cost of their sanity and humanity. Berserkers prepared for battle through rituals that would make modern military psychologists weep. They would consume various substances, mushrooms, fermented drinks, or other intoxicants, while working themselves into a trance state through chanting, dancing, and self-inflicted pain. The goal was to disconnect from their human emotions, particularly fear and empathy, transforming themselves into creatures guided purely by rage and bloodlust. In this state, Berserkers would bite their shields, howl like animals, and foam at the mouth. They believed they were channeling the spirit of bears or wolves, becoming more beast than man. This wasn't just for show. The psychological transformation was real, and Berserkers in their battle fury would attack anyone, including their own allies if they got in the way. The cost of this transformation was enormous. After the battle ended, Berserkers would often collapse into a deep depression, their bodies and minds exhausted by the artificial frenzy. Many became unable to function in normal society, haunted by what they had done and unable to form lasting relationships. They had turned themselves into weapons, and like all weapons, they were dangerous to everyone around them, including themselves. Regular Vikings also engaged in intimidation tactics that required them to do genuinely horrific things. The blood eagle, where a victim's ribs were broken and lungs pulled out to form wing-like shapes, wasn't just a method of execution. It was a terror tactic designed to spread fear of Viking brutality. But performing such acts meant that ordinary farmers and fishermen had to become comfortable with torture and mutilation, psychological burdens that stayed with them long after the raids ended. War cries and battle chants served multiple purposes. They helped coordinate attacks, boosted the Vikings' own morale, and terrified their enemies. But they also helped the Vikings overcome their own natural reluctance to commit violence. Shouting about death and destruction while working yourself into a frenzy was a way of drowning out the voice in your head that was screaming that what you were about to do was wrong. The Vikings also used their appearance as psychological warfare. They deliberately cultivated a wild, unkempt look that made them appear more savage than civilized. Hair was worn long and often braided with bones or metal ornaments. Tattoos and ritual scarification marked their bodies. Their weapons were decorated with symbols of death and violence. The message was clear. These weren't civilized people who could be reasoned with. These were barely controlled savages who might do anything. Ship figureheads carved in the shape of dragons or sea serpents weren't just decoration. They were part of the psychological campaign. When defenders saw these monstrous ships approaching their shores, The carved beasts reinforced the image of Vikings as creatures from nightmare rather than fellow human beings. Fear was their advance guard, often causing defenders to flee before the actual fighting began. But maintaining this reputation for savagery came at a psychological cost that the Vikings rarely acknowledged. Men who had to convince themselves they were monsters in order to do their jobs often found it difficult to turn that monster off when they returned home. Domestic violence, alcoholism, and what we would now recognize as post-traumatic stress disorder were common among returning raiders, though the Vikings had no names for these conditions and no treatment beyond drinking more mead. Chapter 6. The raid begins when farmers become monsters. When the longship finally scraped against a foreign shore, the transformation was complete. The seasick, exhausted farmers who had spent weeks cramped in a leaky boat suddenly became the terrifying Vikings of legend. But this transformation came at a cost that extended far beyond the obvious victims of their raids. The first moments of a Viking raid were crucial. Speed and surprise were everything because once the alarm was raised, defenders would have time to organize resistance or escape with their valuables. This meant that Vikings had to move from seasick exhaustion to deadly efficiency in a matter of minutes, a psychological shift that required them to suppress every natural human instinct toward caution and empathy. Target selection was both strategic and opportunistic. Monasteries were popular targets not because Vikings were particularly anti-Christian, but because monks were generally peaceful and monasteries contained accumulated wealth. A monastery that had spent decades collecting donations and creating illuminated manuscripts was a treasure trove defended by men who had taken vows of nonviolence. From a purely practical standpoint, it was an ideal target: maximum reward, minimum risk. But raiding monasteries meant slaughtering monks, men who posed no threat and offered no resistance. The psychological impact of killing defenseless people was something the Vikings had to compartmentalize or ignore. They told themselves these were enemies of their gods, or that the monks' wealth was proof of corruption, or simply that survival justified any action. But underneath these rationalizations, they were farmers murdering priests, and some part of them knew it. The actual violence of a raid was swift and brutal. Vikings couldn't afford prolonged battles. They were usually outnumbered and far from home. Their strategy was to hit hard and fast, using terror to prevent organized resistance. This meant that their first priority was not just to win, but to create such immediate, overwhelming fear that further resistance became unthinkable. Weapons training that had seemed academic during peaceful times suddenly became horrifyingly practical. The axe that had been used to split firewood was now splitting skulls. The knife that had butchered animals was now butchering people. The psychological distance between these activities was smaller than most people want to acknowledge, but crossing that line still left psychological scars that never fully healed. The looting phase of a raid was organized chaos. Everything of value had to be identified, collected, and carried back to the ships as quickly as possible. This wasn't just about grabbing obvious treasures like gold and silver. Vikings also took practical items like tools, weapons, cloth, and food. They were shopping with violence, selecting what they needed from someone else's life. Captives were valuable commodities, but managing them added complexity to an already dangerous situation. Slaves had to be guarded, fed, and transported, all while the Vikings remained vulnerable to counterattack. The psychological impact of enslaving other human beings was something the Vikings had to rationalize as economic necessity, but the reality was that they were destroying lives for profit. The time pressure during raids was enormous. Every minute on shore increased the risk of organized resistance or being trapped by arriving reinforcements. This meant that decisions about who lived, who died, and what was worth stealing had to be made instantly, without time for moral consideration. Vikings became judge, jury, and executioner in situations where hesitation could mean death. Women and children presented particular moral challenges that the Vikings solved through cultural conditioning and willful ignorance. Raiding cultures develop elaborate justifications for the violence they inflict on non-combatants, and the Vikings were no exception. They told themselves that enemy women and children were not their responsibility, that showing mercy was weakness, and that their own family's survival depended on successfully completing the raid. The psychological compartmentalization required to function during a raid was so complete that many Vikings described feeling like they were watching someone else commit these acts. This dissociation was a survival mechanism that allowed them to function in impossible situations, but it also meant that they often had incomplete memories of what they had done, making it difficult to process the trauma later. Chapter 7: The Slavery Business Commerce in Human Misery. One of the most profitable and psychologically damaging aspects of Viking raids was the slave trade. Vikings didn't just steal gold and silver. They stole people, turning human beings into merchandise to be sold in markets across medieval Europe. This wasn't a side business. It was often the primary economic driver of Viking expeditions. The slave markets of medieval Scandinavia were bustling commercial centers where human beings were evaluated like livestock. Slaves were examined for health, strength, skills, and breeding potential. Young women commanded high prices, particularly if they were attractive or educated. Skilled craftsmen, like metalworkers or scribes, were valuable for their abilities. Children were prized because they could be trained and had many years of service ahead of them. The process of turning free people into slaves was systematically dehumanizing. Captives were stripped of their names, their possessions, their families, and their identities. They were branded or marked to indicate ownership, chained to prevent escape, and transported like cargo. The psychological trauma of enslavement was so severe that many captives never recovered, even if they were eventually freed. For the Vikings, treating other humans as property required a level of moral compartmentalization that damaged their own humanity. They had to convince themselves that their captives were somehow less human, less deserving of basic dignity and compassion. This psychological distancing was necessary for the business to function, but it poisoned the Vikings' relationships with their own families and communities. The logistics of the slave trade were complex and dangerous. Slaves had to be guarded constantly. They would attempt escape at every opportunity. They had to be fed enough to keep them alive and functional, but not so much that it ate into profits. They had to be prevented from communicating with each other in ways that might lead to organized resistance. Managing human cargo was far more complicated than dealing with gold or silver. Transportation of slaves across long distances was a nightmare of human suffering. Captives were often chained together in the holds of ships, in conditions that were worse than those endured by the Vikings themselves. Disease spread rapidly in these confined spaces, killing valuable merchandise. The smell, the despair, and the constant threat of rebellion made slave ships floating hells for everyone aboard. The slave markets themselves were located in major trading centers like Dublin, York, and Kiev. These weren't hidden, shameful enterprises. They were legitimate businesses that operated openly and paid taxes to local authorities. Viking merchants would arrive with their human cargo and spend days negotiating sales, treating the buying and selling of people as routine commercial transactions. Buyers came from across the known world. Arab merchants purchased slaves for the Middle East, where Viking captives were exotic curiosities. Byzantine traders bought slaves for Constantinople's markets. Local nobles purchased household servants and agricultural workers. The demand seemed endless, encouraging more and more Viking expeditions to focus on capturing people rather than just stealing treasure. The economics of slavery shaped Viking society in disturbing ways. Successful slave traders became wealthy and powerful, creating a social hierarchy based on the systematic exploitation of human misery. Communities that had once been egalitarian became stratified, with slave trading families forming a new aristocratic class built on the suffering of others. Children born into Viking families enriched by slave trading grew up in households where human bondage was normal and acceptable. They learned to see certain groups of people as naturally inferior and suitable for enslavement. This cultural conditioning perpetuated the slave trade across generations, making it seem like a natural part of the economic order rather than a moral abomination. The psychological impact on Viking communities was profound but rarely acknowledged. Living in a society where human beings were treated as commodities normalized violence and dehumanization. Domestic slavery meant that even Viking children grew up watching people being bought, sold, and treated as property. This environment bred callousness and cruelty that extended far beyond the slave trade itself. Chapter 8: Life and Death in Battle. When diplomacy failed and intimidation wasn't enough, Vikings had to fight for their lives and loot. Medieval combat was nothing like the choreographed sword fights you see in movies. It was chaotic, terrifying, and usually decided in the first few minutes by whoever made the fewest fatal mistakes. A Viking warrior's primary weapons were designed for efficiency rather than elegance. The battle axe wasn't a delicate instrument. It was a tool for splitting shields, crushing armor, and removing limbs with a single swing. The weight and momentum of a properly swung axe could cleave through mail, bone, and flesh, causing catastrophic injuries that would kill or disable an opponent instantly. But axes were also slow weapons that left the wielder exposed after each swing, requiring perfect timing and positioning to use effectively. Spears were the most common Viking weapons, and for good reason. They were relatively cheap to produce, could be used for both thrusting and throwing, and gave a warrior significant reach advantage over opponents armed with swords or axes. But spear fighting required constant footwork and positioning. One misstep could leave a warrior inside his opponent's reach, where his long weapon became a liability rather than an advantage. The famous Viking sword was actually a luxury item that most warriors couldn't afford. A good sword cost as much as a small farm and required significant skill to use effectively. Swords were prestige weapons, carried by jarls and successful raiders who wanted to display their wealth and status. But even the finest sword was only as good as the man wielding it, and many expensive blades ended up in the hands of dead Vikings who had mistaken good equipment for actual skill. Viking shields were round, made of wood reinforced with metal, and designed to be both defensive and offensive weapons. A skilled warrior could use his shield to deflect attacks, bash opponents, and create openings for his own strikes. But shields were heavy, became heavier as they absorbed damage, and could be split by a powerful axe blow. Shield fighting was exhausting work that required constant attention and movement. Armor was limited and often improvised. The mail shirts worn by wealthy Vikings provided some protection against cutting attacks, but did little against the crushing impact of axes and maces. Most Vikings wore leather jerkins or simply fought in their regular clothes, relying on speed and aggression rather than protection. This meant that even minor wounds could be fatal if they severed arteries or became infected. The psychological preparation for battle was as important as physical training. Vikings worked themselves into a fighting fury through war cries, religious rituals, and group intimidation displays. This artificial courage was necessary because the natural human response to mortal danger is to flee, and warriors had to overcome this instinct through conditioning and peer pressure. But the psychological techniques that made men fearless in battle also made them dangerous to live with during peacetime. The actual experience of medieval combat was sensory overload combined with the constant proximity of death. The sound of metal striking metal, with splintering, and men screaming created an auditory nightmare. The smell of blood, sweat, and human waste, people lose control of their bodily functions when terrified, created an olfactory assault. The sight of friends being cut down, enemies bleeding out, and weapons covered in gore created visual trauma that stayed with survivors for life. Wounds inflicted by medieval weapons were particularly horrific. Axe blows could sever limbs or split skulls. Spear thrusts could puncture vital organs or pin men to the ground. Sword cuts could open arteries or remove fingers, hands, or entire arms. Even non-fatal wounds often led to death through infection, as medieval medicine had no understanding of antiseptics or proper wound care. A minor cut could become gangrenous and kill a warrior weeks after the battle ended. The psychological impact of killing in hand-to-hand combat was severe and long-lasting. Unlike modern warfare, where death is often delivered at a distance, Viking combat required warriors to look into their victims' eyes as they died. The intimate nature of sword and axe fighting meant that warriors had to overcome not just their enemies, but their own natural revulsion at causing suffering. This psychological burden accumulated over multiple battles and raids, creating what we would now recognize as severe PTSD. Medical care for wounded warriors was primitive and often counterproductive. Battle wounds were treated with whatever materials were available: dirty cloth, plant extracts, and procedures based on superstition rather than medical knowledge. Many warriors who survived the initial battle died days or weeks later from infected wounds, internal bleeding, or complications from crude surgical attempts. Chapter 9. The Long Journey Home. Surviving the raid was only half the battle. Vikings still had to make it back to Scandinavia alive, loaded down with loot, slaves, and wounded comrades. The journey home was often more dangerous than the outbound voyage, as word of their raids had spread and enemies were now actively hunting them. Ships heavily loaded with treasure and captives rode lower in the water and moved more slowly, making them vulnerable to pursuit and bad weather. The additional weight meant that waves that had been manageable on the outbound journey could now swamp the vessel. Every storm became a potential death sentence for a ship carrying the spoils of successful raiding. Wounded Vikings required care that the ships simply couldn't provide. Men with severe injuries had to endure weeks at sea without proper medical attention, often dying slowly from infected wounds or internal bleeding. The close quarters meant that disease spread rapidly among the crew, and a single case of dysentery could kill half the raiders before they reached home. The psychological state of returning Vikings was complex and dangerous. The adrenaline and battle fury that had sustained them during the raids gave way to exhaustion, guilt, and trauma. Men who had convinced themselves they were fierce warriors began to remember that they were actually farmers who had committed terrible acts for money. The cognitive dissonance was overwhelming for many raiders. Captive slaves required constant guarding and presented ongoing logistical problems. They had to be prevented from escaping or committing suicide, fed enough to keep them alive as valuable merchandise, and managed in ways that prevented organized rebellion. Some captives, particularly women and children, required medical care that the Vikings were poorly equipped to provide. The weather during the return journey was often worse than what they had faced on the outbound voyage. As raiding season coincided with the approach of winter storms, ships caught in late-season gales faced mountainous waves, freezing temperatures, and the constant threat of being driven onto rocky coasts. Many successful raiding expeditions ended with the entire crew drowning within sight of home. Navigation became more complex when carrying valuable cargo that attracted pirates and rival raiding groups. Vikings had to avoid known shipping lanes and coastal settlements where their presence might be reported to authorities. This meant taking longer routes through less familiar waters, increasing the risk of getting lost or running out of supplies. The distribution of loot created conflicts among the surviving raiders. Men who had fought side by side during the raid might become enemies when dividing the spoils. Disputes over the value of different items, the shares owed to the families of dead raiders, and the proper treatment of shared captives could escalate into violence that killed more Vikings than enemy action had. Food and water supplies that had been carefully calculated for the outbound journey were now stretched to feed additional mouths. Wounded Vikings who couldn't contribute to ship operations and captive slaves who consumed resources while providing no immediate benefit. Rationing became increasingly strict as the journey progressed, leading to conflicts over food allocation and accusations of theft. The psychological impact of carrying human cargo was significant. Vikings who might have been able to rationalize their violence during the heat of battle now had to live for weeks with the evidence of their actions. Captive children crying for their parents, women grieving for dead husbands, and men broken by enslavement created a constant reminder of the human cost of Viking success. Weather delays could extend the journey home by weeks or even months, during which time the psychological and physical condition of everyone aboard deteriorated. Ships running low on food faced the choice of risking another raid to resupply or attempting to reach home on dangerously short rations. Either choice could prove fatal to the entire expedition. Chapter 10. The Psychological Toll of Viking Life. The mental health consequences of Viking culture were severe and largely unaddressed by medieval Scandinavian society. Men who had spent their lives alternating between near starvation and extreme violence developed psychological problems that affected not just themselves, but their families and communities.